Okay. So I will start to point a few critiques that is currently in the debates between, for example, anthropologists and neuroscientists. While anthropologists are sometimes viewed as relativists by neuroscientists, conversely, some neuroscientists can be viewed as reductionists by anthropologists. And to me, it's a problem with the scale of at which the same phenomenon here of consciousness is studied, because consciousness is something at the personal scale, and if you will study it at the anthropology scale, you will, even if anthropologists are looking for universal, they will be confronted by a big inter-individual variance. And at the neuroscience scale, we are more interested in the subpersonal mechanism, and so we'll look for invariance across individuals, but we should be critical about the fact that we are focusing mainly on the so-called weird population, so well-educated Western students that are being examinated in the lab. So it's very particular experimental conditions that allow to focus on this mechanism. And the problem is how to integrate these approaches. And the idea is that constructivism could be a theoretical framework that could help to deal with this problem. Constructivism as such is a general model of learning. It's regardless of the level of or the content on which it happens. It's a more computational, if we take the Mars level type of theory. And it accounts for mechanism without eluding the context. So it's very focusing on situated learning, and then it's thus it's compatible with the interests of neuroscientists or psychologists, also at some point anthropologists that focus also on the context, social context, for example, in which the subject will be learning. So it has been started as a theory of psychology about learning, but it has been then presented as an epistemology, as a general way of how people consider or construction of reality. But I will try to convince you that it also brings new conceptualization on how the mind is functioning. Constructivism is a term coined by Jean Piaget. He was studying learning. Actually, he was developing this view against behaviorism because, according to him, the learner had it was not just about the stimulus and behavioral contingencies, but also the learner had a mental model that will be tested, and this will help him to learn. And this view about constructivism has been has trained a lot of attention, also in the social domain. And it has been a theory of social constructivism, saying that concepts developed at the social scale can have significance that will be not be reducible to the neuroscientific scale. For example, just take an illness like tuberculosis. According to social constructivists, you cannot reduce tuberculosis to just the germs and the microbes that will infect the people. It's also a disease that has been in a given context with some treatments that will shape how the disease should be considered. And just later, there has been it has inspired the school of Palo Alto and radical constructivists. Namely, von Glaserfeld have made a gathering of different works ranging from literature to neuroscience and logic and mathematics to show that constructivism can be a worldview and about how we have access to the reality just through our mental models. So to me, I like to present constructivism as such with 3 steps of logical inferences. So basically, the first one is behaviorism, looking just at stimulus and the behavior and making the links between both. But actually, if you want to understand more precisely how the mind is functioning, you should, according to constructivists, consider that the perceiver is built a mental model of the world that's here called the abductive step, and then he will test this mental model against evidence. And the focus here is about the interactive process that draws these logical inferences. It's an integrated learning process where new evidence will help to either confirm a model, what Jean Piaget called assimilation, or to lead to the construction of new models from the perceiver point of view, which is called accommodation. And the thing is that we can also learn about our own internal states. For example, bodily states, and it has been defended a view about emotions that is linked to interoceptive inference, so inference about our own bodily signals. But it could be also about cognitive states, a view which is not so far from Rosenthal's point of view, about higher order thought theory that mainly says that consciousness is thinking about our own cognitive process. And the key idea is that the learning about our own internal state allows for their regulation. So in the first part, I will focus on emotion and a constructivist view of emotion developed by Lisa Barrett, just as to give you an example of how it has been developed in the theoretical neuroscience, but from a theoretical perspective. And then I will shift to consciousness to see how we can apply this framework. But just before, I will give you some motivations for how it can be relevant to apply it for consciousness. The first question is whether consciousness is an illusion, which has been developed recently in several articles. And actually, constructivism has something to say about that, because according to constructivists, it's not an illusion but a construction. So it's not reducible to the mechanism that we can find in the brain, but it's not an illusion neither. The second point is whether consciousness is a thing or a process inference, for example, what view defended by Friston. And constructivism has something to say, because it says that it's a constructed thing. So it's but it's made out of a process. And then I will tackle also how to account for the diversity of consciousness from a constructivist point of view, and how it allows, with the proposition, to systematically study the variety of consciousness states. So now I will go into the first article from Lindquist and Barrett, which presents emotion as a conceptual act. So they made an experiment where they first primed conceptual knowledge about an emotion, showing a picture of either fear or a natural picture, or a picture depicting anger. And they asked the subject to elaborate on what they perceive in this image. And then they do an affect induction procedure using music, and they show that it's only when you have the two components that it has some emotional consequence. For example, risk aversion, when it was primed with some fearful content. So the idea that we can that emotion is based on interpretation developed before Barrett. For example, distribution of shoulders, the idea can mistakenly identify our emotion, but here it's a bit stronger because it's the emergence as such of the emotion linked the conceptual change. So basically, that means that the psychological events that people call anger, sadness, fear are not basing the building blocks of the mind, so we cannot find them as such in the mind. It's an interplay of more basic psychological ingredients that are not themselves dedicated for emotion. So it's an integrative process where interpretation of the subject has a role to play. And Lisa Barrett developed this view over the years and presented in constructed emotion some further arguments for this view. One is degeneracy, the fact that there is a poor classification performance of emotions based on ephemeral brain activation. So you take ephemeral brain activation of many emotions and you train a machine learning classifier to identify which emotions are which, and there is poor classification, meaning that for the same emotion there can be different brain bases, or conversely different brain base. You can have different emotions that have a similar brain pattern. And so this view is supporting the idea that emotions are constructed at a personal level and not present as such in the brain activation. And emotions are this concept that should be understood in a context and a situated context. And she says that here it's not the same as illusions. They just say that they don't have dedicated neural essences, but it still has emotions that still have a psychological role at the personal scale, but not below. And she's not saying neither that non-human animals or people that don't master this concept are emotionless. So she distinguishes emotion and feeling. Feeling being these interoceptive and internal signals that come to the person, but it must include a perceiver to interpret it. So she emphasizes the point that it's a situated interactive process. And the same process interact to create and regulate emotional experience. And she will develop this idea a bit further through providing mechanism and a mechanistic account on how this constructed consciousness could work, which is called the embodied predictive interoception coding. So she uses a computational theory of how the mind could be functioning, which is the predictive coding scheme, and she adds a structural model to anchor it in brain bases. So predictive coding is interesting to her because it assumes that the brain is making guesses about the world, which is called active inference. So it's not passively receiving the internal inputs, but it also try to interpret it and even predict it. And so this prediction is depending on the preconception that we have. And these expectations that has been learned and are based on past experiences, she says that it's she proposed that it's computed by our granular circuitry to serve an autonomic metabolic and immunological needs. So it's linked to regulation of the internal states based on the cognitive activity. And this has relevance also for mental illnesses, because some diseases like depression could be linked to a misinterpretation of bodily signal or bodily states and just maladaptive regulation. So I will come back on a few points. First, the emotion and degeneracy argument. It could be interesting regarding the first point that I raised about anthropologies that can be seen as relativist, because if you take the concept that is at the personal scale here, emotion, you can see that there is different potential bases for the same concept. So it's not obvious there is only one way to achieve an emotion. But perhaps we should nuance this claim, and it has been also criticized by some other neuroscientists, because there is different levels of invariance. Or, for example, Barrett has criticized Ekman, who made work about the basic emotions. But there is existing also, we know that there is more complex emotion, like shame, for example, that are based on disgust, which is a more basic emotion. So there is different levels of invariance, and we could see that perhaps some more basic emotions can have more shared brain bases because they are shaped, for example, by evolution more than social context. And there is the idea also that evolution can shape integrative processes without the need for cognition, a point that has been raised, for example, by Jesse Prince or Jennifer Robinson, talking about emotional affordances. And so there is a circuits that can be trained and selected through evolution, so which is integrated but doesn't need cognitive regulation. It doesn't mean that there is no cognitive regulation that can be played on top of these, but it's not a requirement as such. But the idea holds that emotion is the integration between different psychological functions through an interpretation that is learned either by evolution or experience. And these emotions can be learned also through social interactions, which shape emotional experience and how they make sense regarding the context. And this is a point that is a bit the same that has been made by some neuroscientists working on animal models who will avoid using terms reserved for emotions when they talk about circuits they identify in animals. For example, Panksepp has developed these points, and to avoid the mental state fallacy, which is attributing some mental states to the circuits. And she also raised the point that scientists must abandon essentialism because these structures are learned and they must study emotions in all their variety and not focus on a few stereotypes. We must assume variability to be the norm rather than a nuisance to be explained after the fact. And this really triggered my interest regarding our research group that is focused on diversity of conscious states. And I will try to show you how this could be relevant for consciousness. Over the last few years, there has been a big interest for the diversity of conscious states with new theoretical tools to characterize them. For example, Bain and Howie talk about modes of consciousness, which are different ways of being conscious. So there is variation not only on the contents of consciousness, but also on the ways that we have to be conscious. And they propose to shift the view from a gradual model of consciousness, they say there is different levels of consciousness, to a multidimensional model of consciousness, where different states can be considered as such, varying on different dimensions that we don't know yet if it's these dimensions are shared by any conscious states. So it's an ongoing project to be uncovering how these conscious states systematically vary on those dimensions. But it has huge relevance, for example, for neural correlates of consciousness. Since if you look for neural correlates of consciousness, you must take into account the conscious states that the person is in, because you will not find potentially the same neural correlates if you study in different conscious states. These are constructed at some point. And even we don't know if consciousness as such, as a concept, is one single concept, or it has multiple brain bases that could lead to the same concept. So I will try to pave a way to address this question and make an hypothesis that conscious states are variations in the way played by different psychological building blocks of consciousness. To make it a bit more concrete, I will take an example of a project that have been developed about video games. So we developed this project with Chloé Svatek and Valérian Chambon to explain, to talk about agency and agency in video games, because video games are specifically interactive compared to movies, for example, or reading a book. So agency, which is the idea that we have a sense of our own action and their consequences in the world, is at the core of the player experience. So when we look at the games, there is different types of games, and the interesting with video games is that they are virtual environments, so they are crafted by the game designers, and this allows for a variety of experiences. And there is games that are focused on exploration. So for example, Minecraft, there is no much goals as such in this game, and not much complex gameplay, but it's just about the huge variety of things that you can do with these elements. While there is other games which are more narration based, for example, an adventure games, where there is an obvious goal and the gameplay is rather simple, or not so complex, or not the focus of this game. And all the stories, all the gameplay is serving to make the story progress. And this is another type of game which is more based on performance. For example, here Hexaflexagon or arcade games. And in these games, the goal is rather simple: is to make a bigger score. And there is not much possibilities, but it's more about the sensory motor interactions. And so the idea is that these are generating different sense of agentive experience that can be described as sense of agencies. For example, in the arcade, it will link to the flow state, where we don't know consciously what we are doing, but we succeed in sensory motor interactions. While in narration, it will be more linked to the meaning that we achieve when we select some actions regarding the story. So there's different type of sense of agency, and actually this can be linked to a specific mechanism in the brain in a integrated model of action selection. So for example, at the motor level, we will select the sensory motor contingencies that will make a successful action, but the meaning is determined at a higher level, which is called distal agency. And then the way we can recombine these goals and the actions and the motor action that we select define a set of possibilities that we can explore to see what's working in the world. And the idea is that perhaps we can systematically map the variation in the conscious states in the same way to be able to identify different functions that are realized in the at the subpersonal scale. And so we have a way to link these different dimensions in the variety of conscious states to an integrated process that will underlie the conscious ability. So to sum up, so consciousness is an integrative process of underlying cognitive function in the constructivist view. And the study of the diversity of conscious states can help to determine which are those cognitive functions. For example, we know that meditation is based on how we can master attention, for example, and we can train to shift this attention, and we'll explore different conscious states. So it's saying that attention could be an important basic building block of consciousness. Also, there is a huge tradition in the Buddhist that Usama Abdul will talk about that has labeled these different variations and can help through training to stabilize them, because if we have this labeling, we can be more attentive and have the conceptual knowledge about these kind of states, and thus we can enter these states and stabilize them more easily. It also is allowing social influences to play a role through either determining lifetime experiences, because it's learning dependent, so social has an influence on how we will develop. Through also interpersonal interaction to attend to specific conscious phenomena. For example, in rituals, there will be a master who will ask the subject to really focus on some part of her experience and help to stabilize or access certain conscious states. Also through providing labels to recognize certain states in some philosophical traditions or cultural traditions. I will say a last word about development. Some evidence suggests that infant consciousness is different than adult consciousness. Some people compare it more to some psychedelic states, like for example psilocybin-induced states. And consciousness is developing. Workshop proposed a 6-level model of the development of metacognition, which could be also a building block of consciousness that is linked to development of consciousness also. And there is also the idea that different conscious states could play different prominent role in the life. For example, REM sleep, which is more linked to dreaming, is more prevalent in the earliest years of life. And the idea is that Hobson has proposed is that we dream a lot when we are young to be able to master our own predictions and know how to master our own internal model, which is really important in the earliest day of life. Okay, to conclude, is consciousness an illusion? I hope to have convinced that this constructivist view can bring some argument to say that it's more a construction than an illusion, because it's a thing made of a process inference. It's not reducible to the sub-personal scale, but it's also there is conscious states as such, which result from the integration of these underlying processes, and these states could play different functional roles. So how to account for the diversity of conscious states? It could be tentatively explained by variation on the weight put on different subcomponents of these processes, and that can be shaped by experience or evolution even. For example, if when we go to sleep, it's more neuromodulatory changes that will drive us to change conscious states. And how to systematically study the variety of conscious states. So I hope I proposed a way based on this example with video games to develop such kind of approach. To come back to the first question, how to integrate this approach. So here constructivism doesn't say what consciousness is as such, it just says that it's an integrated process of underlying psychological functions. It offers as such a framework that allows for interdisciplinarity and systematic study. Thank you for your attention. So we have just a quick time for question, but then we'll make a short break and we can discuss more. Oh.
Thank you. It's more like it's a very brief anecdote and then a very brief question or opinion on a topic. Basically, I had a chance of I had a dinner with Daniel Dennett and Rosenthal once.
Mm-hmm.
It was a very fun dinner, you know, because these guys have all these very deep we had in the stakes and so on, and these guys have all these very different views of you know what the mind is, consciousness is an illusion or not, and whatsoever. But at a given point, I started wondering, you know. What have you experienced yourselves? I mean, we have these tools for neuroscientific research that are called 2A receptor agonisms. They go by many names. The mostly well known is LSD. So I basically asked Rosenthal and Daniel Dennett whether they have ever self-experienced with psychedelic drugs, especially Daniel Dennett, because you know if you read his books, it's basically this guy needs to basically, you know, try to. These drugs are tools for him, you know, for research. And basically, he said no, that he only did weed a couple times because LSD could fry your brain. But my go to the question is, what is your opinion on self-experimentation in the context of constructivism? Whether you speak of this cycle of, you know, behavior, and then a stimulus, and then behavior, and then you break this cycle when you speak of, you know, a model or interpretation. How important is self-experimentation for you? I mean, or for whatever constructivism as a whole is, you know, to move forwards in the field.
Yes. Okay, for my personal opinion, the idea is that through constructivism, actually, your experiences and what you know will depend on your lifetime experience and your trainings and what you do in your life, and it serves some specific functional roles as such that you don't experiment, for example, as some psychedelic states, and that could be really functional to you. So it's not a problem as such. It's true that if we want to investigate the diversity of conscious states and consciousness as such, perhaps it will be interesting to experimentally test the effects of such variation in conscious states. And actually, it can be attained in many ways. So it's not has to be drug induced, even if it's a very direct way to do it.
It's the easiest, but sometimes it could be the easiest.
Yeah, but it raises also other problems, because then you shift so you have a mechanistic insight at very basic, but we saw that consciousness is an integrated process of many different brain functions. So it's to make the link between these very low-level mechanistic changes and the high-level changes that is consciousness is such a gap to do. So I bring that will benefit to change at different levels of integration to study how, so at the molecular level, but also changes that are brought by cellular changes or at different scales, and this will help us to systematically map the variations that are triggered by such variations. And
yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Anyway, Rosenthal is like 90 years old, so it's too late for him to take LSD for the first time.
Yes. Could you please pass the microphone?
Hi. I'm wondering on the when you mentioned that the conscious states are the hypothesis that variations in the weights of the psychological building blocks. It seems like the question is shifted from is resolution of the phenomena study, right? So it's like we could think of like a general conscious state, and then we can decompose it into several sort of like psychological building blocks. So what is the right level of zooming into the psychological building blocks, and if you can give an example? And what happens with that scale if the question then becomes, well, what are the building blocks of those specific psychological building blocks, and what would be the adequate level to, you know, stop zooming in? I don't know if it's kind of a clear question.
Yes. I think that there is like there is a level of integration between the subpersonal and cerebral scale and the personal scale, and so you should zoom perhaps just below to understand what are the psychological functions. For example, let's take attention or metacognition, or so this would be the level just below that we should consider at first. But then there is also potentially influences from molecular levels that will shift this level just below. Also, so for example, through drug-induced or during sleep, for example, when the neuromodulatory context is shifting, there is attention is not the same, for example, and it will shift the way that we are of being conscious. And also there is influences from the cognitive interpretation as well. So it's not obvious at which, for what I presented, it was just at the scale just below the personal level, because that the first thing I was investigating when we thought about this integrative process. But I don't know, it's still developing, so I have no really precise idea on how to integrate very basic level, like molecular levels or social influences yet. But it's more like for social influence, it will more be like redirecting your attention, or it will be perhaps more how to shape the functional walls of this sub-personal function. So I couldn't really elaborate further on that.
Yeah, no, just wondering on like what would be useful for example, a neuroscientist trying to develop this isomorphic sort of mapping, right? So, you know, what would be the right, you know, it's a personal level, and if so, you know, which could be an example of?
To me, it's very like attention, perception. So these big psychological functions that memory that are integrated in some sense to generate consciousness. And then there is molecular changes that will shift the way how these functions are either functioning or being integrated. So perhaps we'll do a short break and restart in 15 minutes.